This is the first episode of a series that I'll be doing here on my channel at irregular intervals, a look at shipwrecks that history has all but erased. We've already explored some forgotten names on here before. You might remember the wreck of the Indian, or the Hungarian, or the T.J. Potter, or others that slipped through the cracks of official memory. This series will continue that idea. These aren't just unidentified wrecks that people see all the time, or cold case mysteries. These are ships that were forgotten entirely. Their stories are closed books. Their stories exist only in fragments. A stray newspaper clipping, a note in an archive, or sometimes something stranger. We start this mystery with just a name, a date, a handful of artifacts, and the lingering knowledge that this story has been underwater for a century and a half. And like any good mystery, the more I looked into it, the deeper the story became. A ship with no surviving photographs, a ghost town of a shipyard, and a storm that erased the vessel in a single night. This is the story of the Adgillus, a wreck that nobody remembered until now, on Part-Time Explorer. This video was also made possible by my supporters on Patreon. Visit the link in the description below to consider supporting. Every so often, I like to talk about a shipwreck that nobody's ever really heard of. And right now, it's a very windy day out, and that's got me thinking about the wreck of the Adgillus, which sank during a storm. See, I'm right off of the ocean here, and we have a big storm coming in off the waves, and that's the kind of storm that took out the Adgillus. I had never even heard of the shipwreck until I acquired this plate here. It's an old piece of china with gray transferware on it, and on the back is a sticker that says 1874 Adgillus, Irish Sea, recovered seabed 1992. I knew nothing else about this, and there wasn't much online. How did this piece get from wherever it was made to the bottom of the Irish Sea to my bookshelf? And what was that wreck like? Well, it's time to do some digging and piece together a story from scraps scattered between archives on 3 different continents. Every so often, a plate like this turns up. Something curious, quiet, forgotten. And if you're like me, you can't help but wonder what story sank with it. Shipwrecks like the Adgillus vanish not just from the sea, but from memory. And once the last eyewitness is gone, unless someone digs through archives on 3 different continents, that story is gone forever. I should note, by the way, that the pronunciation of the ship is a little bit of a gray area. It's spelled Adgillus, but there's a chance that it was pronounced Adgillus. Adgillus was a 3-masted wooden bark built by a shipbuilder named Oliver in 1873 in Quebec City, Canada. Quebec City in the mid-1800s was a booming hub for wooden shipbuilding. For a time, it was second only to London in the number of ships launched annually. Timber was cheap, labor was skilled, and the British Empire's appetite for merchant vessels was insatiable. But the boom would be short-lived. By the 1870s, steamships were beginning to take over, and iron-hulled vessels from places like Glasgow and Sunderland were rapidly pushing wooden barks, like the Adgillus, out of the market. So the fact that the Adgillus was even built in 1873 makes her something of a holdout. In the 1800s, there were 4 different people in the Oliver family in Quebec that were building ships. Well, this one seems to be the least successful and the least documented. In fact, the Adgillus and her smaller sister, the Fostadina, are the only 2 ships that we have records of them ever building. The Oliver family's shipbuilding operations are a bit of a ghost story themselves. Unlike most of their contemporaries, they don't even leave much of a paper trail. Their yards don't appear in most of the typical registries, and the construction of the Adgillus and her sister are really the only mention of these yards at all. It's entirely possible that they were just contract builders working under a different shipyard's banner, or perhaps their venture was short-lived, folding before they even found footing in an already oversaturated market. Either way, the construction of the Adgillus now becomes a valuable trace of a nearly invisible chapter in French-Canadian maritime history. Adgillus and Faustadina, by the way, are two characters from a 19th century book called The Golden Cap, about the King and Queen of Friesland, or Northern Netherlands, who welcomed Christianity to the area around the 700s. Now back to the ship. The Adgillus had a tonnage of 415 and was only 142 feet long. This wasn't a big ship by any means, and her launch and her career went by without hardly being noticed. I haven't found any images whatsoever of the Adgillus, but here's a similar ship under construction in a similar Quebec shipyard, to give us an idea of what that construction may have looked like. She was launched around the springtime of 1873, about the same time the SS Atlantic wrecked 2 provinces away. The ship was initially owned by C.W. Wilson, a merchantman in Quebec, and he also bought the Faustadina from the shipbuilders, although he had it renamed the Helgoland almost immediately. Adgillus crossed the Atlantic at least twice for Wilson, making the crossing in 22 days eastbound, carrying general merchant goods, 1 day faster than her sister. Within only the first year, though, Adgillus and Helgoland, the former Faustadina, were sold off. Adgillus was sold to Thomas Harrison of Liverpool, who kept her in merchant service, although her tonnage was reduced to 410. It was October 1874 when she was being prepared for a voyage out of Liverpool. I've seen it written that this is her second voyage, although that doesn't fit perfectly. That would mean that she only ever sailed 1 round-trip voyage for her previous owner, and then a full year had elapsed since the purchase before she sailed again. I mean, it's possible, but it's also possible that second voyage means the second voyage for her current owner, Harrison. She was under the command of a Captain Martin Thompson, with 16 crew under him. The vessel was loaded up with salt and goods bound for Africa. It was on October 14, 1874, when the Adgillus left her wharf at Liverpool, although she waited a full week for favorable weather before leaving the river. This allowed for an additional cargo of gunpowder to be loaded on board. October 20th, a tugboat met her at her Mersey River mooring, piloted by a Mr. Parry, and brought the Adgillus out to sea. The tugboat cast the lines off for Adgillus somewhere between the Belle Buoy and the Northwest Lightship, with Mr. Parry remaining on board to pilot the vessel to Point Linus. The role of a maritime pilot like Mr. Parry was, and still is now, incredibly specialized. These were seasoned navigators who knew every turn of the tide, roll of the waves, and every shoal hidden beneath the sea, and they often learned it through years and years of experience rather than by studying nautical charts. Bringing a vessel like the Adgillus out from the congested Liverpool docks and through the sandbanks of the Irish Sea required a practiced hand. Once past Point Linus, however, the ship would typically be on her own. The crew would shift from deferring to the coastal pilot's navigation to trusting in the captain's open water seamanship, a transition that marked the true beginning of a long voyage. From there, the ship would sail around Africa to Brass River. Today that's in Nigeria, but then it was referred to as Old Calabar. It seems that Mr. Parry had departed at Point Linus as planned, but this can't be totally confirmed. But by midnight, the wind had picked up. Shortly after 12, it was blowing at a full gale, with the wind shifting in heavy squalls. Adgillus' sails were torn up, and all cargo on deck was washed overboard. It's worth noting that in 1874, Britain's meteorological department was in its infancy. They had only just begun issuing storm warnings a few years earlier to the public, and they were often too vague or too late to act upon. Communication delays between shore stations meant that typically by the time the warning was posted at a port, the storm might already be underway at sea. Adgillus' decision to wait a week for favorable weather may have been based more on gut instinct and sky watching than reliable data. Once underway, there was little that they could do but trust their sails, their rigging, and their fellow sailor. The full gale that struck in darkness with shifting squalls was likely not just unexpected, but entirely unpredicted. 3:00 a.m. All hands were mustered on deck. The hatch covers and most ports had been washed away, allowing a steady flow of water to crash below decks, with each and every wave breaking over it. The crew were kept busy manning the pumps, desperately trying to keep the ship afloat. Although it was believed that the ship had been completely pumped dry by 4 a.m., the storm quickly reclaimed its ground, and the ship was heaving and lurching violently. Adgillus' crew put in a fight, but by 11 a.m. the ship was so badly listing that the crew began dumping cargo, likely starting with the sacks of salt and gunpowder. As a precaution, they readied the ship's longboats in case they needed to evacuate. They continued the fight for over 3 hours when the ship finally began to give in and founder. Adgillus rolled sharply, lifting the boat clear from the ship before the first mate could jump aboard, and he was left behind. Another man left aboard was a sailor from Malacca named Antonio Natal, who had remained at the aft end of the Adgillus and never moved forward to the boat. Chances are he couldn't swim, and he was terrified of letting go of that vessel and making a leap for the boat. Ironically, most sailors at the time didn't know how to swim because their work didn't require them to go into the water, just to be on the water on a ship. This stuck vividly with the survivors, as they had actually managed to row the boat around to the stern, close enough for him to jump as the ship was going, and he would have been able to make it to the boat, but he made no effort. He was just frozen in terror and went down with the ship. Adgillus dropped rapidly, likely on a fairly even keel in the final moments, and disappeared with Antonio and the first mate, whose name sadly appears to be lost. The boat, under the command of Captain Thompson with 14 others on board, drifted clear just in time. It rode out the rest of the storm, drifting 9 or so hours until they reached the Morecambe Bay lightship and were rescued. The courts decided that the wreck was simply an act of God and nature, and found the Adgillus to have been a sound ship in good condition at only a year or so old. They also found that the captain and crew had done everything within their power to try and save the ship. The mention of Antonio Natal, the sailor from Malacca, is one of those footnotes of a story that sort of sticks with you. Malacca, today part of Malaysia, was once a major trading hub, a cosmopolitan port at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean. Antonio likely was a lascar, a term used for sailors from South and Southeast Asia who crewed British and European ships. Often underpaid and poorly treated, these sailors were nonetheless essential to 19th century global trade. We don't know much about Antonio, but the image of him frozen with fear, standing alone on the stern as the sea took the ship, is one of those details that somehow brings the whole disaster into sharp human focus. That was the end of Adgillus' story until August 9th, 1991, when her wreckage was picked up on sonar in 37 meters depth, or 121 feet. The wreckage was mostly intact and sitting upright, allowing for an easy salvage of artifacts. In May 1992, the salvage ship Recovery 2 by Anglo-American Marine was sent out with Captain Gary Goodyear and lead diver Steve Pickering. Over the course of the dive, they recovered several artifacts, including the ship's bell, which read Adgillus, which was how they were able to confirm the identity of the vessel. They also recovered thousands of long-stemmed clay pipes known as churchwarden pipes. And in addition to that, they recovered a beautiful Martini Henry rifle, the standard issue rifle for the British Army, which only entered production and began being issued 3 years prior, in 1871. Those long-stem clay pipes recovered from the wreck, often called churchwarden pipes, were more than just smoking tools. They were cultural objects. Their long stems kept the smoke cool, and their use was almost essential for late-night conversations among men of all levels of society back then. In fact, pipe fragments are among the most common items found in 19th century shipwrecks. Crews smoked constantly. It was one of the few luxuries they had in harsh discipline and hard-working environments. The fact that Adgillus carried thousands of them suggests that it was part of her cargo, possibly bound for colonial merchants in West Africa. Imagine these delicate items stacked in crates, surviving the sinking, the sea, and a century on the seabed, and then resurfacing nearly intact. Artifacts of not only the shipwreck, but a nearly vanished British culture. I can't find a formal database online of what was salvaged, but I've found 3 different plate designs with the recovery stickers on the back by searching online. 2 of those designs are presented here. These plates were all made by Staffordshire, with the gray pattern having a mark on the back indicating that it was made in January 1874, earlier the same year that it went down to the bottom of the sea. The other pattern is known as spongeware, as a sponge is used to apply that design. I'd had this plate in my collection for years, but then when I decided I wanted to turn this story into a video and share it with you, I bought this plate specifically for the telling of this tale. I have no doubt that the dive team or the salvage company has a few more bits of information that would add to the telling of the story from when they were down exploring the actual ship, but my attempts to contact them have been unsuccessful. While there isn't much more that can be said about the old Adgillus, it's incredible to finally know the history behind these 2 plates, giving them an even deeper meaning to me and significance in my collection. A huge thank you to my friend David St. Pierre for searching the Quebec archives for the Adgillus and turning up a few bits of information about her construction. David is an expert historian on the wreck of the Empress of Ireland and published an excellent book on that subject. That book is available in both French and English. As always, a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankertz, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Mollikar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Madtime Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Frazier, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy B, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira's Trains, J.C. Hobbs, High Treason, The Peppermilk, Tristan White, Jason Stray, Chance Hudson, Robert Mayer III, Jordan Page, The Handler, Georgia T, Drew Shelton, Craven Moorhead, Jennifer and Sarah Vaughn, Ben Reese, Kenneth Hendricks, Aaron Prochaska, David Douglas, Alan and Modesta Charlone, Eric Castle, Lottie Katz, Jean Kennedy, Lilia Bean, Bianca Signorini, Greg the Fox Bauer, and Jeffrey Gautier.